So a little bit about the podcast. The broader theme is just stories of heroism and activism.
Okay.
So our goal today is actually just to learn about you and why you got into this work, what keeps you motivated, what keeps you going, and at the same time really helping our listeners understand like the actual technical legal implications of your work and why
Okay.
mega dairies are an issue. So let's just start in the beginning. Like, where are you from? Or give me your 30-second bio.
Long time ago, I was born in Albany, New York. I spent parts of my summers on the St. Lawrence River, and that was a major part of my life, still is, and a major part of what I am, who I am, and what I do today. But I left high school when I was 16 and went to college, a little place called Simon's Rock in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. But I spent a couple of years there and then tried to figure out what I wanted to do in life and took a semester off. Graduated still when I was 20. Then I had my early retirement years, as they call them, my years between college and law school. I probably had 20 different jobs, from environmental activist to tea packer at Celestial Seasonings, to bartender, to tennis instructor, to carpenter, all those kinds of things. And I would spend the summers in the Thousand Islands and had a lot of fun doing that, and figured out kind of who I was and what I wanted to do. And during those years of the late 70s, I got involved with a group called Save the River on the St. Lawrence River, which was started to protect the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes from winter navigation, year-round shipping. And that was an Army Corps of Engineers proposal to reconfigure the Great Lakes and the connecting rivers, like the Detroit River, the St. Mary's River, would have required blowing up islands, widening and deepening channels, even more than they had done when the St. Lawrence Seaway was put in the 1950s. And I ended up doing my college senior thesis on that project. And we defeated them. We defeated that Army Corps of Engineers, which is, back in those days, was rarely done. And still to this day, there is not winter navigation on the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River. So that was kind of my formative years of activism. And I worked with Save the River in a volunteer capacity and then in a paid capacity for a little while, and got to experience a lot of fairly intense campaigns, worked with some amazing people. Considered one of the greatest organizers and influencers of the 20th century, Abby Hoffman. Got some great experience, learned a lot what to do and not to do from people who've done it before. And I realized that I needed more tools to do what I wanted to do and to have an impact on society, social justice, and human rights, which I view environmental protections to be an essential human right.
I want to ask you a quick question about Simon's Rock.
Yeah.
Because I'm a product of a liberal arts education, and I am a huge believer that one of the engines of activism is critical thinking. And like successful activism, you actually have to have like a good mind about you.
Right.
And I'm wondering, like, going to a school like Simon's Rock, having that like very classically liberal artsy experience, like how do you draw on that in your work?
All the time, because liberal arts, you think of everything. You take, it's interdisciplinary. You try to think about how everything works together. And my son, for instance, is in mechanical engineering, and I was like, "You sure you really want to do that?" He's like, "No, I'm not." I was like, "Well, go get a liberal arts education, then you can figure it out. You can narrow yourself down. It's harder to expand yourself out over time, but having a base that teaches you to think critically and holistically.
When we were working on a lot of the Hawaii GE pesticide issues, I kept thinking, like, when I was reading about corporate power, when I was studying like the ideologies underpinning the global economy, I never realized how applicable it would be in real time in my community, in my backyard. And like you said, it's so hard to like teach someone who's thinking so small to kind of think really big. And then you start to realize that the small, like we're smallifying these systems.
Right. No, and that's the old expression, all politics is local, but it also has national implications. And a lot of my work has been very local. It tends to be, if you will, sort of test cases of pushing the law to where it should be. And then it ends up having ramifications at the state and federal policy and legislative levels, because it challenges the law to be what it's supposed to be, number one, and it also expands the law as people know it. And it blows people's minds sometimes that the law actually says that kind of thing and needs to be applied to them.
One of the hardest things of this podcast is going to be helping everyday folks understand the role that environmental litigators play, because lawyers, as a general rule, don't have the best reputation.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, and I don't like most lawyers either.
But I want to go back to that moment. You just are off this victory, saving the St. Lawrence River or the Great Lakes region from further dredging and plowing and remodeling for capitalism. And you say, like, I decided I needed more tools. Right. I'm assuming that you were going to talk about going to law school.
Right. No, that's true. And I took, when I graduated from college, I immediately applied to law school, was accepted, and I deferred, and then I deferred until it expired. And then I skipped another year, and I applied again, was accepted and waitlisted, and I decided I still wasn't ready. So I skipped another year, and my fifth year out, I applied again and was accepted. And I said, all right, it's time. Because I was floundering. Floundering's not the right word, but I hadn't found my thrill yet. I hadn't found the thing that turned me on. And I went to law school to become a social justice lawyer. And at the time I went in, it was going to be human rights or the environment. And as time went along, I realized environmental rights, as I said before, are a fundamental human right. And we need the environment to exist, as we see with all the climate change issues going on. And we are peripherally involved in some of that litigation, writing amicus briefs, and that kind of work that inspires me to keep doing what I'm doing.
So you go to law school, you decide that you're going to be an environmental litigator. And give us a little, like, what were the next few chapters? How did you end up doing what you're doing? And maybe you can tell people, what do you do today?
I'll start off with what I do today. I've been an environmental litigator my whole career, since I graduated from law school in 1987. I have sued corporations in probably close to 30 states, using environmental laws, common law, like toxic torts, things that people my age would remember would be Love Canal or Times Beach, Missouri. The younger folks might think of something like the recent movie Dark Waters or Aaron Brockovich. I do exactly those kinds of things, and have done those throughout my career, representing primarily community groups, people who have been directly impacted, and using the tools that the law provides to give them access to justice. I remember in law school in my third year running into two of my professors at a playground. They were playing with their kids. I think I was playing tennis with somebody. And they said, "So Charlie, what are you going to do when you get out?" And I said, I'm going to sue corporations for fucking up the environment. And they said, "Well, oh, really? How are you going to do that? Do you have a science degree?" I said, "No." "Do you have, this degree or that degree?" Or I said, "No." And they said, "Well, how are you going to do it?" I said, "Watch me." That was the answer.
Where's
And,
that part of you from? The watch me.
this is something I've joked about with my friends a lot. I always thought I was shy. And they told me completely the opposite. You've never been shy. I guess I've always had an edge to me, I guess, is what I've been told. I see social injustice and I do something about it. I don't just sit and watch it or say, "Oh, that's terrible." If I'm in a direct situation and there's conflict, I usually insert myself in some way, which can be very dangerous in some situations. When in other situations in the law, a true lawyer's role in society is being a problem solver, not a problem creator, a problem solver. There are a lot of problem creators in the law, mostly the clients who are the problem creators, but a lot of defense lawyers are problem proliferators and problem deniers. So it's difficult to get to solution.
So I want to go to your first big case. Here you come out of law school, you're going to sue these big corporations. You've already seen that you can be an effective activist and stop major damage to the environment. Right. What was the first case when you were like, this is big? And tell us a little bit about the issue it was addressing.
Well, oh boy. Three of them come to mind. Just to go back though, how I got my first job, I worked at an organization called Atlantic States Legal Foundation. And I had met the guy who was the founder of it probably back in 1981, I believe it was, or maybe 82. I think it was 82. When I was working at Save the River, and he came up to speak at a conference that I helped organize. And there were these wonderful people from all around, from Save the River's contacts, who came and spoke. And then I saw him again the February of my last year of law school. And I said, "Oh, you're at Atlantic States Legal Foundation." I said, "You're going to hire me when I get out." He looked at me and went, "Well, what are you talking about?" I said, "Hey, you're Atlantic States Legal Foundation. You don't have any lawyers. You need a lawyer." And he said, "Well, I don't know what you're talking about." So I went back and I talked to him in May. I said, "You're hiring me. I'm going to be ready as soon as I finish the bar exam in August." And I went back to him again. He's like, "Well, I don't know. And I walked in. I said, "All right, I'm ready to start." And he didn't have a choice. He hired me. There was no interview,
Charlie,
no resume.
I have a couple experiences like that too, where I demanded the job that I was then offered.
Right. I was never offered the job. I just took it. And at the time, Atlantic States had about 100 different lawsuits going on. They were all citizen suits under the Clean Water Act for discharging in violation of Clean Water Act permits. And in about maybe a dozen states, and Atlantic States had, 15, 20 law firms working for them. And over the course of my first year at Atlantic States, I either casually let some of those law firms go away in the representation, or I fired them and I took over the job myself. And there were three cases that were huge cases. One was called Supporters to Oppose Pollution. That was the name of my group, STOP, in Indiana, in central Indiana, not too far from South Bend. And there was a commercial hazardous waste disposal facility that was violating every which way you could imagine. It was like worse than a CAFO in the mid 1980s. CAFOs are concentrated animal feeding operations, by the way, and we'll get to that later. But this was a mom and pop type of commercial hazardous waste disposal facility that took hazardous waste from the Chicago area, nasty stuff, and they weren't doing anything right. And right when I became a lawyer, I was asked to negotiate on behalf of the local organization in a federal court in South Bend, Indiana. The United States Department of Justice and EPA were in the case as well, and we were interveners. And the lawyer who was running for Congress at the time in Indiana promised to provide representation, but when it came down to it, he felt that the citizens really didn't have a right to be there because he didn't know the law and he didn't have a clue as to what the environmental laws were. So I stepped in and helped out, and I'm as fresh a lawyer as there can be. And I ended up going to a conference where I was the expert on RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And so my first 3 weeks on the job, I read RCRA. It took me about 3 weeks to read it. And that was for the first time. And, I started figuring it out, what the hazardous waste laws were. And the Department of Justice lawyer wasn't very happy because I basically said, if you don't take this case to trial, then you're a laughing stock and the government's useless. And I got up and walked out and had to fly to California to another case I was working on, and left the lawyer who was going to be handling it holding the bag. And he's like, Jesus Christ, Tebbutt, thanks a lot. But I was the bad cop. So I left the room, and we ended up going to trial a year later. And it was a 3-month trial in South Bend, Indiana, federal court, in front of then the youngest federal district court judge in the United States. I think he was only 32 years old, a Reagan appointee. And we spent 30 trial days over the course of 3 months trying the case with the Department of Justice and EPA at the bench with us. And we actually became fairly friendly because we were on the same side. And it was the most intense legal experience of my life because I was so young. And my head hurt at the end of trial every day because I realized that as a lawyer, you use muscles in your brain that you never used before. It's like, using an iPhone or something. You don't even know what it can do. And you find all these things that you need to do, memory, intensity, listening to every word that happens in court and dealing with that. And at the end of that 3 months, it was only, I think, 10 days later that the judge issued a 180-page written decision permanently closing the hazardous waste facility, which was the first time in the United States that had ever happened.
Wow. And
the federal marshals came and put the padlocks on the facility. My clients came to celebrate and were chased. My last two clients, who were the main organizers, husband and wife, were chased off the road by some of the purveyors of the landfill. And a couple days later, they heard shots going off outside their house. And then a couple nights later, there was a keg of roofing nails laid in their quarter-mile-long driveway. And they didn't tell me all of this until a couple of weeks later. And I said, why didn't you tell me immediately? You were federal witnesses in a federal case. And I immediately called the FBI, and they got on it, and they called the owner of the landfill like immediately. And because half an hour later, the guy called me back and said, I just talked to the owner of the landfill. And I said, if anything happens to these people, we're coming after you first. And so that's just an example of how you use the law effectively. Not that I'm a great advocate of the federal government by any means for its failure to protect human rights and the environment. But there are times when, if you know how to use the mechanisms, you can use them to your advantage.
Something that like strikes me that I think a lot about is the chutzpah we have when we're young. Just the willing to be like, fuck you, I don't need the experience, I don't need the credential, like I'm passionate about this and I'm going to figure out how to do it. And I don't know if it's society that like tries to beat that out of us, or as we get older, we look at those 26-year-olds and we're like, whoa. But at the same time, you think about the age of Martin Luther King in his 20s, like these great activists were actually really young. And there's something about that bravery and inexperience that sometimes I feel drives phenomenal change that we don't fully honor as activists. That like young people aren't just annoying. They're actually sometimes the energy we need to get up off of our butts and believe that change is possible.
Absolutely. I mean, youthful enthusiasm is wonderful. And when you add a few tools to the tool belt, it makes you so much more effective. And there's so many examples of that. The Juliana versus United States case, where the youth activists are challenging the government's role in contributing to climate change. That's a great lead example, and those are happening lots of different places. Greta Thunberg and the plaintiffs, testified in front of our Congress, with my partner Andrea Rogers sitting right behind them, who helped prepare them for that testimony in DC a number of years back. One of the questions from Congress was, so, what are you doing to fix this problem? And the kid laughed. He goes, we're suing the federal government. And he was about 17 at the time.
That's amazing.
But what a great response. It's because the federal government has failed in its public trust obligations to protect people and the planet.
One of the things that I've experienced in my own work, and I think everybody experiences over and over again, is like a crisis of consciousness, and a sense that like maybe you want to quit, or this fight is too big. Like, can you talk about a major challenge that you grew from in your work?
All of them. And I hope I'm continuing to grow. In my old gray bearded years, not maybe so much as I used to. The challenges, there's so many. I went to work for a law firm in Buffalo that did the Love Canal cases. I was there in the early 90s, and those cases only resolved a few years ago, the rest of those cases. So they went on for over 30 years. Love Canal was probably considered the first and foremost toxic chemical case on record. And what happened was Hooker Chemical, based in Niagara Falls, New York, later taken over by Occidental Petroleum, Occidental Chemical, was making dioxin, later came into the Agent Orange realm, and was also producing dioxin as a byproduct of a lot of its other chemical processes. And they buried all their toxic waste in an abandoned canal that a guy named, I think his name was Henry Love, started to build between the Niagara River and Lake Ontario. Right? It was a bypass around Niagara Falls. I should say it was from the upper Niagara River to the lower Niagara River, but it never happened. He started building it, so he had this big ditch. And so Hooker Chemical took it, buried all their chemicals in it, buried it over, and in the early 1950s, sold it to, or really gave it to a school district for $1. The school district built a school on top of the Love Canal. And in the probably late 60s, stuff started oozing up out of the ground, these purple, gooey, oozy, smelly things. that literally ate through the sneakers that kids were wearing on the playground. And in 1978, I believe it was, possibly 79, Jimmy Carter declared it a national emergency and evacuated the people at Love Canal. It was the first federal government evacuation due to toxic chemicals. And so people were moved out of the first ring of Love Canal and into other places around the area. And in fact, a bunch of them got moved into another toxic place that DuPont and Hooker and Union Carbide were responsible for called Hyde Park. So they got the double whammy because they later got moved out of there.
Ugh.
Yeah, lovely stuff.
Sounds like the federal government is the villain in a lot of these stories.
Well, our federal government, the military in particular, is probably the single largest polluter in the history of the world. And the federal government is often not only a cause, but an impediment to clean up too.
The polluter is also the protection.
You know, with the powers that be, with the industrial powers and the corporate powers that play the puppets in Washington, that often happens. They're the puppeteers.
Knowing just how deeply entrenched corporate power is in American government, has always been and continues to be, why do you keep doing this?
Because it makes a difference. The law does create more of a level playing field. And the Clean Water Act and RCRA and all of the federal environmental statutes, or most of them, have some very strong case law with citizen enforcement provisions. In fact, those were the first direct citizen suits that were allowed. The 1970 Clean Air Act, the 1972 Clean Water Act, all provided citizen suit opportunities. And that's what I do. I represent community groups. I'm sort of what's called, in fact, by the Supreme Court, a private attorney general. I sue polluters, violators of federal law when the state and federal governments fail to do their jobs.
So I want to shift a little bit to the CAFO animal ag work that you've done. So first, like, lay out for our listeners, like, what is a CAFO? What role does it play in the food system? Like, set the scene.
All right. CAFOs are concentrated animal feeding operations. And that's the sort of industrial way of now raising and torturing animals before we eat them. In the old days, I grew up in one of the big dairy areas of the United States in northern New York. I'd go through there all the time. In fact, the first word I said was moo, ironically enough. And, back in the day, you'd see cows out grazing on grass. Well, you don't see that anymore. Cows don't, except in the organic realm. In the CAFO realm, a cow has never stepped foot on a live blade of grass in its life. They're in confined pens their entire lives, sometimes thousands of animals on mere acres. And they're just fed out of huge trucks and feed alleys, corn and other stuff that might be shipped hundreds or thousands of miles, corn from the Midwest out to the Northwest or somewhere else. They're fed things that aren't their natural diets. They're fed corn and other grains that aren't part of their natural diet. So it's an unnatural process to begin with. And then you concentrate so many animals in one place and disease happens. You have worker safety issues. The workers are generally undocumented workers. So they are abused because they don't have standing to challenge their employers. If they do challenge them, they're just fired and let go. You know, the animals are unhealthy. They're just mined for their milk or their meat or whatever it is, eggs, whatever the situation may be. And this is the predominant form of food production, meat production, particularly meat and poultry in the United States. 1989, I went to the Public Interest in Environmental Law Conference for the first time in Eugene, Oregon. And my mind was blown. There were more public interest environmental attorneys in about a 10 square block area of Eugene than there were in the entire state of New York at the time. And I became friends with a number of the people, including the founder of the co-founder of the conference, Mike Axline. And in 1994, when he split the Western Environmental Law Center off from the law school, I was hired to work on Columbia River Basin pollution issues. And I sued a bunch of polluters, but I went to a conference where the head of the Department of Ecology from Washington said the single largest source of pollution in the Great Lakes Basin are dairies, CAFOs. And I went, huh, okay, I'm going to look at that. So I hopped in a plane, or we chartered a plane from Lighthawk, which is a nonprofit that helps the environmental community and others with providing free planes to fly over projects. And I went up and flew over the lower Yakima Valley and all the huge dairies there. And, 5,000 feet up in the air, you could smell the shit, literally. And we developed some cases, and that was in May of 1997. And in August of 1997, somebody we were working with hooked us up with the community groups who'd been fighting these issues. It was kind of like the old, again, I'm dating myself, but the Network TV movie that's an iconic scene where the network executive opens the window and yells out in New York City, "I'm sick and tired of this and I'm not going to do it anymore." That was my client, Helen Redout, who had that same experience, and she relates it to Network. That was in the 80s, where she woke up and she couldn't breathe because of the ammonia emissions from the nearby dairy. And we ended up hooking up together through this mutual connection, Bill Bean from what was then the Columbia Basin Institute. And we met up in late August, early September. And by October 31st, 1997, we had 10 notice letters out the door to CAFOs, big dairies that were discharging their manure into the local streams. And those were what I would consider probably the first coordinated campaign style enforcement cases against CAFOs in the country. And we won those cases. And then the 2013 cases, what we call the cluster cases, Cow Palace, Bosma, and DeRuyter, were for groundwater contamination. The CAFOs just dig holes in the earth, and they put millions and millions of gallons of shit in there, and they let it sit and they let it percolate. And as any one that knows anything about percolation goes, that stuff's going to percolate down to groundwater, and it did, and it's contaminated tens, if not hundreds, of square miles of aquifer in the lower Yakima Valley. And I've been working on those cases since 1997, and I'm still working on them, still trying to get cleaned up. So to get back to your one question, how do you get out of bed in the morning? You just have to keep doing it. If you didn't, you'd never get out of bed. So you have to find your passion and get out and fight the good fight. And that's what keeps me going.
Critical is like a community of friends and colleagues in your work. Like, I know that you've worked with CFS over the years. Like, who do you draw on for support in your like darkest nights?
Well, the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference is our refresher. every year, and it has been since I started going in 1989. I've probably only missed 3 or 4 since then, and plus 2 because of COVID. But that's our way. The public interest community gets together and talks about what we're doing, and not only talks about what we have done, but what we need to do to make progress going forward. And then we get back together every year and we see how we're doing. We see how our progress is, what worked and what didn't work, and what we need to do to make things work. And so that we do have a very large and wonderful community of committed people to do that. And, of course, I have some very good friends who I rely on when necessary, and fortunately have a lot of them through our work over the years, both clients and lawyers.
Who are your mentors? Like, who do you look to teach you, and who's teaching you right now?
I've worked with a lot of great people in my life, and I've seen how they've operated. I've seen the pluses and minuses of how they've operated. I have very good friends and very good mentors in the law, some non-lawyers. I mean, Sam Sage is as interesting as he is from Atlantic States, allowed me to do a lot of things once I convinced him to hire me. And Richard Lippis, his firm, and Mike Axline, who hired me. I consider them, Ward Stone, actually, who I mentioned earlier, too, was a great mentor. But I also look at them not just mentors, as colleagues, too.
I think so often we think of mentorship as hierarchical. And some of my best teachers are the people I'm running alongside of, who are holding me accountable and pushing me and challenging me. It's not my Yoda sort of Jedi moment.
Right.
How has this work transformed you?
Well, one friend who told me, he goes, "Yeah, Tebbutt, you used to get drunk and stand up on the soapbox when, you were working for Save the River way before you went to law school. I think you're just the same person you always were. You just found more tools to do the job."
What's like 2 or 3 things an everyday person can do to kind of support your work or help move the needle on some of the issues that you're working on?
Well, wherever, and I tell my clients this all the time because they tell me these stories. Look, I saw this and this happened and that happened. I said, "Did you take pictures? Did you write down what happened?" "No, I didn't. I didn't think about that." Well, a lawyer's only as good as his or her facts, or their facts, I guess would be the appropriate way to say it these days. And so that's what I tell people. I can't win without facts. I can't just make this shit up out of thin air. I got to have photos. I got to have stories. I got to have notes. I got to have documents that show what the problem is. So I would just say to people, wherever you see a problem, document it, and then find somebody who can help you. There are other people like me out there. So bring it to somebody, find somebody. Public Justice, for instance, has a website that has I forget what they call it, Public Justice Advocates, maybe. There's a group of people who can help in that situation. I mean, I know I'm on that list. You can go to my website and you can ask me for help. I get calls all the time from all over the country. What can I do about this problem? And sometimes people are able and willing to get into it, and others don't want to get too heavily involved because it's dangerous. They could be either economically or physically threatened in their communities, because the communities generally are small, the corporations have lots of power, and the closer you get to the community source, the more power they have. And so that can be a problem, but you have to be strong, you have to stand up, and you have to punch the bully in the nose. And usually the bully cries and runs away, or, can be at least held to account. And so that's what I do. I hold these bastards to account.
A woman. Final question, Charlie. What's the best piece of advice you've ever gotten in your activist journey?
Good question. Take names and kick ass.
Awesome. Anything else you think is worth sharing? Any stories or vignettes that are coming up for you?
I could go on for days.
I know, I love it. I love listening to people talk about their activist journeys. So I'm so glad we spent this time together.
No,
And again, I think
too.
the arc of our query is like, what does it take? We want to inspire activism. We want to help people see that we can make a difference. And it takes a certain attitude. I mean, it's why I asked the question about Simon's Rock. Is there anything else in the ether that you think is necessary to kind of take names and kick ass?
Persistence and perseverance. Document things. Don't be afraid to stand up. Stand up for what's right. Find like-minded people who have skills that you don't have. Basic organizing 101 is use your strengths, and find people that have complementary strengths so you can get shit done. And that's, at the local, state, and federal levels. Don't be afraid to go up against the powers that be. The powers that be don't know what the hell they're doing. It's the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. They're just grabbing stuff and trying to figure out how to make things run, and they don't know the hell what they're doing. Tell them how to do it. Show them how to do it. Bring the science. I mean, that's one of the big things I see with a lot of the community groups and my clients is access to science. Right? You can't find scientists, it's hard to find scientists who are willing to stand up and fight the system, because the system's what's paying them. Most of those scientists are academics that work for universities or governments, and they're going up against the people who give them the grants or who provide the funding for them, and they don't want to stand up against them. So finding a true scientist who's willing to speak up is very helpful. And we find most of the time they're retired government scientists or retired academics, because they can now speak up freely and stand up against the interests that may be. I had one guy who worked for the pesticide industry for a lot of years, and I knew him. And I said, will you give me a declaration that explains why this chemical, acrolein, is a problem and is persistent in the environment? And he did. And about a year later, he said, Jesus, Charlie, you wouldn't believe the shit I got from the pesticide industry, from the American Chemical and American Petroleum Institute, all these guys. They wanted to ostracize me because I worked with you. And I said, well, thank you, Glenn. You were wonderful. Thank you very much. Speak truth to power. That's what you have to do.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point about power actually being the Wizard of Oz. It's a performance.
It is.
I think I learned that early on. It's like people that have power aren't there because they're smarter than you, or they're more capable, or they're more competent, or they care more. So all you have to do is
oftentimes it's a lot less. They rise to the level of their own competency.
Yep. What's giving you hope right now, Charlie?
Well, the youth, with all the issues that are going on in the world, I remember how hopeless I felt as a youth. And now things are exponentially worse with more people on the globe, the daily confrontations of climate change and its implications for all of society. I just, what gives me hope is that youth are standing up. Not enough, but youth are standing up and they're fighting for their futures. And we need more persistence, perseverance. But that's what helps me get up, is I know that there are people taking over. You are young, relative to me, at least. And you know, you're fighting the good fight, and others are doing the same. And we have to provide the tools for everyone to be able to achieve social and environmental justice.
Amen. Well, Charlie, I'm grateful you spent the hour with us.
It's been a lot of fun, and I look forward to conversing
Big
with you.
promo. Yeah, we'll keep you posted.
Yeah.
Happy Wednesday.
Thank you.
All
We'll
right.
see you
Talk to
again.
you soon.